Hi, everyone. Welcome, everyone. I'm extremely excited to moderate our panel today on the past, present, and future of social democracy in New York and the United States. My name is Joel Suarez. I'm an assistant professor of labor studies here at SLU. And I'm gonna begin today with a few brief words about Josh and the theme of his book. Then I'll introduce the panelists and we'll discuss the history and politics of social democracy. And then finally, we'll conclude, I think, in the last 15 minutes or so, opening up questions to the audience. So just be sure to go ahead and send those questions now. You don't have to wait till the end. All right, so to get started, I should preface all this by saying that I talked to Josh last week. And for those of you that don't know him personally, despite his tremendous accomplishments as an educator, historian, and political organizer, he's also an extremely modest person and doesn't like to be the center of attention. So he, of course, told me he didn't really want him or his book to be at the center of our discussion today. But the conference itself is a celebration of Josh's book and his career. So it's necessary to, at the very least, say a few quick words about his book that brings us all here today. So, as I think Samir really eloquently put it in the opening panel, Working Class New York is incredibly unique for a number of reasons. It's deeply researched, well-written, and forcefully argued, of course, but it also anticipated a couple of really important things. First, as Samir noted, it anticipated many of the historiographical trends that are vibrant today in the history of capitalism and labor history. And secondly, and perhaps even more impressively, the book also anticipates a lot of the politics that we're living with today. And nothing encapsulates that more than the title of the closing section of the book, Trump City. The task that Working Class New York sets out for itself is deceivingly modest. It seeks to make up for, quote, the astonishing blindness to the city's working class displayed by writers and other historians of post-war New York. So while many writers celebrate New York's literary, artistic, business, and political giants of the post-war period, Josh really forces us to think about the city's working class. And more provocatively still, he argues that what gave New York its distinctive character was precisely the world its workers made. Post-war New York was home to a vibrant labor movement that gave the city, among other things, affordable and convenient public transportation, rent-controlled apartments, union-sponsored co-op housing and public housing, tuition-free college, such as CUNY, a quasi-public arts center for working-class audiences that provided free or heavily subsidized symphony, theater, opera, and ballet performances, 22 municipal hospitals, more than any other city in the US, and it also provided among the most aggressive anti-discrimination policy in the United States. So Josh argues that these accomplishments, forged through the struggle of unions and leftist political parties, constituted a social democratic polity. And yet, as I just mentioned, the book closes with the emergence of what Josh presciently called Trump City, a city that embraced austerity in the wake of a fiscal crisis and then saw working class power crumble away. Working Class New York, in other words, is a story of both class composition and class formation. Class formation and class decomposition. At the time of its publication in 2000, the book was hailed by Tom Sugrue as, quote, an extraordinary achievement that offers a powerful historical context for the ongoing struggles for equality and democracy among the beleaguered American working class. Now, these words were written in a world in which globalization, welfare reform, and Alan Greenspan were all held in equally high esteem. It was a world before the financial crisis, the Obama presidency, the Trump presidency, the Clinton and Sanders candidacy, and the resurrection of social democracy, to say nothing of socialism, as an idea worth debating and an ideal worthy of struggle. To think about working class New York today is to consider not only social democracy's history, but also its possibilities and limitations. Now, the social democracy that Josh wrote about, of course, cannot simply be repackaged and revived in the 21st century. And this might sound cheesy, but to quote a famous ancient Greek philosopher, quote, nothing ever is, everything is becoming. No person ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and the person is not the same. In other words, the politics of social democracy have been forever changed by the neoliberalism that displaced it. Though it should also be said that neoliberalism itself is not a static, ahistorical project, and that it too has been changed by the challenges of social democratic politics, and one hopes it can be perhaps entirely overcome by it. Now, a social democratic future, of course, is far from certain, but a future in which the current order is reproduced ad infinitum is equally uncertain as well. And it's this very ambiguity of our moment that makes this discussion of social democracy all the more urgent. When I went back to reread Josh's book a few months ago, I was struck and in many ways awed by the ability of New York's working class to build the city that it did in the post-war period, only to see that city crumble in the wake of its financial crisis. But rather than a simple declensionist narrative, Josh's book perfectly captured the movement of history. It captured the provisionality of social worlds that seem so permanent and sturdy. The 1970s, that period of transition between worlds, reads as pivotal precisely because it was provisional and it's marking the beginning of the end of one order and the emergence of another. In fact, reading Josh's book and then reflecting on our own unique historical moment today, I was reminded of what Eric Hobsbawm once wrote, reflecting on his life in interwar Europe. He said, and I quote, "It is difficult for those who have not experienced the age of catastrophe of the 20th century in Central Europe to see what it meant to live in a world that was simply not expected to last, and something that could not really even be described as a world, but merely as a provisional way station between a dead past and a future not yet born." And so with that, I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce our panelists today to discuss the dead past and this awkward way station of our historical present, all in hopes of thinking through and maybe shaping a future that is not yet born. So I'm just going to introduce everyone in alphabetical order, but I should mention Steve Fraser was supposed to join us today, but he had an emergency to tend to. And while, of course, we wish he could have joined us, I just wanted to let him know that we're all thinking of him today. First up is Deepak Bhargava. He's a distinguished lecturer at the School of Labor and Urban Studies. He's a policy expert on issues of poverty, economic justice, racial equity, and immigration, and has been an organizer for 30 years around issues of immigration and social democracy. Along with Ruth Milkman and Penny Lewis, he has co-edited a brand new, fascinating book titled Immigration Matters: Movements, Visions, and Strategies for a Progressive Future, published by the New Press. We also have Nelson Lichtenstein, who is a recently retired distinguished professor of history at UC Santa Barbara, where he directed the Center for the Study of Work, Labor, and Democracy. He's the author and editor of a number of essential books in labor history, perhaps most prominently State of the Union, A Century of American Labor, and Walter Reuther, The Most Dangerous Man in Detroit. He's currently embarking on a fascinating new project on former Secretary of Treasury Robert Rubin that I think we're going to hear a little bit about today. And we also have Ruth Milkman, a distinguished professor at the CUNY Graduate Center and chair of the Labor Studies Department at the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. She's a sociologist of labor and labor movements and the author of a number of groundbreaking books, including Gender at Work, Farewell to the Factory, LA Story, and more recently, Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat, published just this last year by Polity. And then finally, we have Touré Reed, who's a professor of history at Illinois State University, where he teaches courses on Black social, political, and intellectual history. He has published widely on race and class ideologies, African-American politics, and public policy. And his first book was titled Not Alms, But Opportunity, The Urban League and the Politics of Racial Uplift. And he also has a more recently book titled Towards Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism, published by Verso Press just this last year. So I'm going to begin with a set of 3 interrelated questions that I think Josh really wanted us to discuss, but I'm going to push you all to sort of think about them historically. So the questions are, they seem simple, but they're big. And that is social democracy still a viable program? Are progressives too focused on restoring the programs and politics of the New Deal? And can the shattered social democratic coalition be reconstituted? So those are big questions. But I just want you to think about what exactly social democracy means today, what it possibly meant in the middle of the 20th century, and maybe think about how its fortunes changed and faded in the late 20th century and where it stands today as an idea in relation to other social movements. So I'm just going to go in order for now. So let's just start with Ruth. Is social democracy still viable today?
Well, I think, that remains to be seen, but I would say that what people in other parts of the world call social democracy right now in the United States tends to be called socialism, which is probably a misnomer, but, Bernie Sanders style socialism. And well, we'll see if it's viable, but it certainly has had new life breathed into it in recent times. Before I answer your other questions, I just want to add my voice very briefly to the chorus of fans of Josh Freeman, who is a wonderful colleague, an amazing scholar, and I'm proud to say a great friend. And getting back to the topic of the session, in the book, Working Class New York, among many other things, he argues that New York City historically is really the only social democratic city in the country. I mean, maybe we could debate that whether there's some other one somewhere, maybe a small college town or something, but basically, like where I went to graduate school, for example. But so that's the claim. And, even though that legacy has been eroded quite a bit in recent decades, the legacy is still there. So, for example, union density, which was at the core of the, again, in Josh's view, and I think we'd all agree, what made it happen in part was the strength of organized labor, and union density in New York remains about double the national level, more than any other major city. So, that's a inheritance of those days, along with the, broken as they are in some cases, all the infrastructure of things like transit, public housing, and healthcare, which are, are still different here than elsewhere, even if they're not what they used to be. Anyway, to answer your question, or try to, I think, the obvious point is that the core of the decline of 20th century social democracy, mid 20th century social democracy, is the destruction of organized labor, which we've seen unfold over recent decades, but also the destruction of the left. And those two things, of course, are interrelated. So, really, I think we shouldn't forget that. And just in the same way, if there is a future for social democracy, it is coming from people who call themselves socialists. And so we have I don't want to say new left, because that term refers to a different generation, my own, but we have something happening that promises to revive some of those traditions. And, even though a case can be made, and I sometimes make it, that unions are cool again, for that new generation of leftists, like, we're seeing, maybe we'll talk about this more later, but it's still difficult to imagine the restoration of anything like the level of political clout and density that organized labor had in the middle of the 20th century, even in New York, where, as I said before, density is twice the national level. It's a shadow of its former self. So if there is going to be a social democratic revival, it's going to have to come from somewhere else. It's going to have to come from civil society in some way. And that would include a lot of different things potentially. Not, one thing it should include is what some people call alt labor, the non-union part of the labor movement, which, is flourishing here in New York as well as many other places. But also other social movements like the ones that we've seen flourishing in the last decade or so since the Great Recession. So that's probably enough for me for now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Me too. I should have been a panelist. All right. Nelson, how about your thoughts?
Hi, delighted to be here. Let me just say one word about Josh. I first met Josh for the first time in 1975 when I was a kind of editor / foreman in a non-Fordist industry in New York City in publishing. And he had just written a review of Cairo's book on Robert Moses, who I don't think I'd even heard of him at the time, Robert Moses. Anyway, Josh immediately gave me a sweeping history of New York and why it was essential. I know everything about it. But I was struck that was an early, probably maybe the first thing he ever published, possibly, on this review. And in some, I don't know what, it wasn't a journal. It was maybe it was the Boston, anyway, it was one of those new leftish kind of journals. And then his last chapter in Working Class New York is on Trump City. And I'm thinking, Moses to Trump, there's something going on here. There's an arc here. Let me make this point about social democracy and its prospects. I think, and this is it's in Josh's work. It's in all of our work. Many of the panels. I think it's part of the world we discussed. Let's make a distinction between social democracy and the welfare state. I think social democracy, whether in Europe or New York, or by the way, Hawaii, I think would be another, Ruth was mentioning other places. I think Hawaii might be the other place, implies a politics in which there is a left, whether it's in the unions or in some other formation, but it's there, and it has power, and it's engaged politically and economically and culturally and every other way in contestations and pushing forward a program. And, and obviously that's what Working Class New York is all about. But then there's the welfare state, which is social democrats want a welfare state, but a welfare state is not quite the same thing as social democracy. And we do have examples, both in the academy, as historian scholars think about it, and in politics, of trying to create a welfare state without a union movement or some other formation, of whether it's alt labor or something else, some other kind of movement, which has a kind of institutional weight to it. So I'm thinking of like Theda Skocpol in all of her work and the people around her. They were trying to, why is there no welfare state in America? And and it was kind of a state-centered, and it had to do with all sorts of embedded histories, etc. But it really didn't. It decentered the labor movement. I mean, and that was an argument, and we can argue about it, but that was a one way of thinking about it. And there are obviously elements of that the sort of decentralized nature of the U.S. Obviously, race. There are all sorts of reasons we didn't have a welfare state, which I think she and others applied was sort of kind of part and parcel of, capitalism, late industrialization, etc. Politically, here, and this is what I'm working on, and I won't go into it on this round. I'll wait another bit. But someone like Clinton, Bill Clinton, was from Arkansas, no labor movement there, and he wanted a welfare state, in many, but he was unwilling to. The labor movement was not going to be part of it, and he wasn't willing to expend any of the political capital to help create a labor movement. It would have been impossible anyway in the 90s. But he was, if you ask him, he wanted a welfare state. I mean, he wasn't against it. He wasn't a kind of Alan Greenspan sort of a person, or some Milton Friedman sort. He wasn't that at all. And then, because let me wait my next round, I want to talk about Robert Rubin a little bit. Again, who wanted, he also wanted, maybe even wanted a welfare state more than Clinton. Now, I don't, something of the equivalent, but he was unwilling to do anything about that would fetter in any way the free flow of financial capitalism, which he would, spend his life advancing. So but I do want, the only thought I want to leave you with is this: let's make a distinction between social democracy and the welfare state. They often go together, but they aren't quite the same thing. And I think that's important. My next round, I'll talk more about Robert Rubin. Okay.
Great. I'll set up a good question to team up. Torre, let's hear from you.
Oh, thanks for having me. Before I launch into my spiel, let me just say one quick thing about Josh. Josh Freeman is taught. I first crossed paths with Josh my first semester in grad school at Columbia in 1993. And I'll just say this: I could have imagined no better professor to have an introduction, to have introduced me to the field of labor history, but more to the point, graduate programs in general. I think all of us, or at least I certainly recall, maybe it was me, but most doctoral students are neurotic messes. And I know I was my first semester. And Josh was such a supportive and kind and brilliant scholar, all rolled up into one, that he made it, helped to smooth my transition to grad school. So I will always be indebted to him for that. So to move on to the questions, and I probably won't attempt to answer all three, but I will touch upon two at least. So the first is social democracy viable? Well, if social democracy is about improving the material lives of working people, God, I hope so. Because if it isn't viable in the United States, then we're all screwed. That doesn't mean that the path forward is easy. And I think the path forward is obviously quite difficult. With regard to one of the things potentially cluttering the path forward being the suggestion that progressives might be too invested in defending the legacy of the New Deal, or restoring, I guess, the New Deal. I wasn't really aware that progressives were interested in restoring the New Deal per se. I mean, I think that I'm keenly aware of efforts. I'll just say this: I'm keenly aware of efforts to try to, take the New Deal as, and these are the rights efforts, to treat the New Deal as a proxy for all things bad about state action. And in fact, I'm aware of both the right and centrist Democrats' investment in taking the New Deal, again, as evidence of the inherent inability of a social democratic state to deliver for, Americans across racial lines, right? Because the New Deal is allegedly inherently racist. And, so those people who I know who are invested in exploring the complexity of the New Deal these days aren't so much interested in making a case for returning to the New Deal as it was. Who in their right mind would want to do that? Considering that the New Deal comes about in a time period in which scientific racism, in an unambiguous way, unlike ancestry DNA, which is a more ambiguous version of scientific racism, but nevertheless, unabashed scientific racism, the kind the Nazis embraced firmly, was part of American culture and society. Blacks obviously did not share equally in the rewards of the state, the rewards of capitalism or the state, and certainly the New Deal state, right, which we all know and have long known. So I don't think that there are a lot of people who are interested in restoring the New Deal exactly as it was, but people do certainly point to the New Deal as the best that America has had to offer working people. And it's a starting point for a better society and a better version of American democracy, something on the spectrum of social democracy, but that wasn't quite there, I think. And what then references to the New Deal and efforts, again, to highlight what was good about it in recent years come down to, I would submit, would be an effort to push back against the right's assault on the ability of the state to deliver. I mean, for almost my entire life at this point, at least for 4/5 of it, I've lived under some regime or another that insisted that government is not the problem, it's the solution. Government is not the solution, it's the problem. I look at it the other way, hence that slip. But nevertheless, and in that context, it's crucially important to point to the things that the state can do to make people's lives better. And the New Deal is illustrative of the things that the state can do. And before I cede the mic, I'll add one other element. While, the tendency, again, the commonplace tendency is to insist at this point that the New Deal was inherently racist. I often enough these days have been besieged by assertions that that I'm a revisionist for insisting that Blacks actually did benefit from the New Deal, even if they didn't benefit equally, which isn't news. I mean, it's just something I learned in 1988 in my first year in college when I'd read Harvard Sitkoff's A New Deal for Blacks, which was 10 years old at that point. So, it's long known that the New Deal did not distribute its rewards equally across racial lines. So there's very clearly a kind of sensibility in this moment that I think is that comes down to a resistance to feeling the burn, as it were. It comes down to a pushback that's oddly bipartisan that against the kind of zeal or interest in social democratic politics that was energized by the Sanders campaign, right? By way of stripped down reductionist visions of characterizations of American history that actually, interestingly enough, ignore historiography. Now, I'll stop because there's a lot more I'd like to say, but we can get back to that later or so.
Thank you. That gives us a lot to discuss and debate. But Deepak, if you could chime in on that question.
Yeah, sure. And it's a real pleasure to be here with this group and to really honor Josh's contribution today. So I think my answer to the question is that social democracy is the right aspiration, but that it's a project, at least right now, of creation, not of recovery. So, I looked at Working Class New York again last night and kind of looked at it through the eyes of an organizer, which is what I am. And I was very moved by the extent to which I think we can learn from the solidaristic ethos, the kind of emphasis on mass participation in political and civic life, the emphasis on small d democratic organizations, unions, civil society groups, community organizations, to contest for power. Like, that was incredibly inspiring and moving. And I think that is our heritage. And I was also struck in the way that Josh tells a little bit of his own story in the book. My father was, for many years, a taxi driver in New York City. And I went to college out of a fund that Taxi Workers Union, which was at that point affiliated with SEIU, had established for the kids of taxi drivers. And it's just kind of part of that fabric of rich associational life that is especially our heritage in New York. So I'm also grateful to Josh in that personal way for like a window into how to tie our individual stories into this collective project of social democracy. I do think we're actually on the cusp. I don't mean to be overly optimistic, but I actually think we could be on the cusp of a kind of a new foundation in the next decade. And that's not probably going to advance through nostalgia for the past program or the past coalition that brought social democracy about. We'll need new programs, new coalitions. There's no ideal past to return to. I really agree with Touré about that, that the program today needs to engage much more seriously at the intersection of race, gender, and class together. And, we've been contending with neoliberal and white backlash to the gains of the freedom movements of the 1960s and 70s ever since that time. Almost since the gains were won of inclusion, they have been deeply contested. So I think it's pretty clear that a more modern program for social democracy will include traditional preoccupations, but also much more centrally concerns about gender and race and the environment. So I think you can also begin to see the new version or a new coalition to power that kind of change in the most progressive elements of the labor movement inside unions and in the broader kind of alt labor space, in racial justice movements and immigrant movements. You can see it in, I think some of its progress is being manifested in the more progressive elements of Biden's program on the green economy and the care economy. So I'm actually fairly optimistic, but not because I think we ought to be looking backwards, except to some of the principles of organizing, solidarity, and collective power that I think are at the heart of Working Class New York, Josh's book, but more because I think something new is stirring that's very promising.
Thank you for that. So I have a lot of thoughts, but let me maybe qualify some of Tori's comments, because I do think among progressives there is, at least at the discursive level, this if not nostalgia, at least a framing of modern progressive politics with sort of the language of the 1930s. So obviously there's the New Green Deal, there's Biden himself saying he wants to be like FDR. And then there's the Bernie Sanders phenomenon. And I'll never forget in 2016 at the Democratic Convention, when his brother certified the votes and he's like, this is, I'm voting for Bernard Sanders, and our parents who really, thought highly of the program of Roosevelt. But clearly so much has changed. Ruth mentioned, the demise of the labor movement, of union density in general in the United States, but there's a whole host of other changes that I think have shaped social democratic politics today. So clearly, the social democracy that Josh speaks of was constituted by a multi-ethnic working class. It was in a city where there was a lot of manufacturing employment that was, skewed heavily towards the sort of male breadwinner model. And today we have, an economy dominated by low-wage service sector work, in which women are prominent, particularly in the care sector and education sector. So I'm wondering, like, how first, and I guess to set up Nelson for for his talk about Robert Rubin, like what happened, like how did we get this structural shift, and how does this structural shift, both economically and politically, change the substantive demands of social democracy today? So maybe I know I mentioned Tori, but let's start with Nelson, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, I'll just maybe this will be so provocative that you'll want to pile on, and it's not a defense of Robert Rubin, but it's a replacing him. So one of the things about Josh and any good historian and Josh is you have to know who your enemy is. You have to know what is the appeal of those people who are against you or against you thinking historically. Why do they seem to be? It's not just the club in their hand. They always have an ideological and cultural appeal as well, and often within your own movement. So in contemporary discussions of neoliberalism, including, of course, the subversive impact this economic doctrine has had on what is left of the welfare state, no figure has occupied a more symbolic place than Robert Rubin, undoubtedly the most influential economic policymaker in the Clinton administration. And I'm writing a history of that now. When he left his post in 1999, Bill Clinton declared him the most important and successful Secretary of the Treasury since Alexander Hamilton. An exaggeration, but truthful to the degree that Rubin combined both skillful statecraft with ideological persuasiveness. Unlike Fed Chair Alan Greenspan, his rival and collaborator, Rubin was hardly an Ayn Rand acolyte. And to the degree that Rubin, who had served as co-chair of Goldman Sachs, was the principal economic policymaking figure in a Democratic administration, one that was elected in opposition to the Reaganite policies of the previous 12 years, at least rhetorically, that was the case in 1992, Rubin looms large indeed. Well, his appeal to liberals arose because his neoliberalism, a phrase that today I think does as much to confuse as elucidate, was encased within a New Dealish, even a popular front, cultural and political outlook. There's no doubt that his actual economic program stood athwart such a cultural politics, but the combination of the two, including his argument that under late 20th century conditions, efficient markets could generate welfare state outcomes, seemed to put him in opposition to the more retrograde social politics of either Greenspan or the Reaganites. Rubin was a Democrat of great charm and erudition. Although he'd grown up in Miami, his roots were in New York, where his grandfather, who had been a delegate to the 1936 Democratic National Convention, ran the most powerful political club in Brooklyn. Rubin's mother voted for Henry Wallace in 1948, and he would vote for George McGovern 24 years later. Educated at Harvard in the 1950s, Rubin was, by his own account, something of a coffeehouse intellectual, a liberal who sought a society, quote, a society that works for everyone instead of just a few. When serving in the Clinton administration, he opposed the president's controversial and much despised, well, by liberals certainly, welfare reform on the grounds that capitalism sometimes creates victims as well as victors. As Rubin wrote in his memoirs, I felt strongly that some people on welfare are unable to work for reasons that are beyond their control, whether psychological, physical, or simply through lack of work skills and work habits. He spent a year at the London School of Economics, 3 more at Yale Law, and then he moved over to Goldman Sachs, where he spent the next quarter century on risk arbitrage, a hugely lucrative form of stock trading that put a premium on financial liquidity, capital mobility, and the split-second decision-making. It was a nerve-wracking game at which he thrived. Rubin remained a steadfast Democrat during his ascent at Goldman Sachs. He raised money for Democrats, backed Mondale and Dukakis, and then jumped at the chance to join the Clinton administration. He embodied the degree to which a sizable Wall Street minority thought the Democrats offered the best road to the kind of social and political stability best suited to an ever more expansive financial sector. Well, here I want to offer just two examples of policy decisions in which Rubin played a central role, using them to explain why his brand of fiscal austerity and financial deregulation proved attractive to some liberals and maybe reluctantly so to the labor movement, but also why it subverted those social democratic impulses that had played a large role in putting Clinton and other progressives in the White House. Despite years in Arkansas politics, or maybe because of them, Bill Clinton was an industrial policy progressive whose campaign for president in '92 promised to use a combination of taxes, regulation, and expenditures to revitalize productive forces in the American economy. Japan and Germany were seen as both rivals and models, varieties of successful capitalist economies that differed from that of laissez-faire. Robert Reich, Ira Magaziner, Derek Shearer, Laura Tyson, Joe Stiglitz, Jeffrey Garten, and Hillary Clinton, too, were key advisors pushing this outlook. Rubin also wanted to revive American capitalism, but he thought that a restructuring of market forces the path toward that end. Instead of a feeble $50 billion stimulus that Robert Reich advocated in the first Clinton budget, what seems pretty feeble today, Rubin convinced the president and most advisors that $2 trillion in new investments would be forthcoming from private sources if the Clinton budget tilted toward balance, thereby inducing or seducing a bond market interest rate plunge. Lowering interest rates on bonds if you had this balanced budget. Such austerity was root canal politics, quipped Alan Binder, a member of the Council of Economic Advisors, but liberals were somewhat assuaged by higher taxes on the rich and the slashing of the defense budget that eventually created an actual budget surplus. This was the context in which James Carville famously quipped that if he were reincarnated, he wanted to return as the bond market, the most powerful thing on earth. Indeed, who could challenge Rubin's understanding of Wall Street's mentality, that of bond traders in particular, in whose hands lay the road to lower interest rates and a bonanza in new investment? As it turned out, the low interest rates characteristic of the 1990s did produce a speculative boom centered on the stock market and Silicon Valley, and New York real estate too. But more important, it meant that investment decisions were unguided by the hand of government and would be left entirely in the hands of individual capitalists. I'm almost finished here, but a second Rubin intervention came in the abolition of the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act, which severed investment banking from the more old-fashioned and better regulated commercial bank lending. The demise of that law, which would vastly enhance the growth of derivatives and other speculative practices, was a foregone conclusion even before the end of Clinton's first term. The law's most prominent supporter, in fact, was a liberal Republican, James Leach. But the formal modernization, that was the phrase, of banking finance was held up by Phil Gramm, the Texas Republican senator, who insisted that the civil rights-oriented Community Reinvestment Act must also fall with the demise of Glass-Steagall. But here Rubin and every other Clinton advocate of market liquidity drew a line in the sand. The CRA, the Community Reinvestment Act, which required banks to lend money to distressed neighborhoods, had to be preserved. This was both a political calculation. Jesse Jackson's Chicago organization was both a beneficiary and champion of CRA, and the kind of moral battle against Graham that the Clintonites were delighted to wage. But it was also a form of three-card monte, in which liberals invested energy and attention towards saving CRA, and they did successfully, while Glass-Steagall collapsed and various forms of derivative trading flourished. So what does all this have to do with the prospects for social democracy in New York and the nation? Rubin was not alone in his culturally cosmopolitan advocacy of the welfare state, but when it came to the fundamentals of financial capitalism, he could see no other world than one which enhanced capital mobility, financial deregulation, and the monetization of corporate assets, and encouraged a plethora of innovative securities designed to hedge risk and leverage capital. He believed that business confidence had to be sustained to keep interest rates low and investment healthy. Maintenance of the proper market psychology was therefore a responsibility of government as well as Wall Street. It required budget austerity. In Vietnam, it was said that the village had to be destroyed to save it. The same could be said of Robert Rubin's effort to sustain the 1990s welfare state. Thanks.
Thank you for that. I really, really appreciate it. And to sort of get this, to put that all in context, I think a good pairing with Rubin would be obviously Paul Volcker, and the Volcker shock in 79 to 82 that really sort of helped speed up the deindustrialization of the United States, and marked this shift to an economy really predicated on mostly like low margin profitable industries in the service sector, and really fueled speculation. But part of this whole politics, you mentioned welfare reform. I want to get us a little bit back on track, because it produced a very curious racial politics today that at the time that I think we're still living with today. So you all can have any reflections you want on what Nelson just said, but I also just want to add to the mix. Like, so this is one of the questions that Steve really wanted us to consider, and that is like how, and sorry, here we go. How does contemporary racial ideology shape social democratic politics today, and how might social democracy transform racial ideology in a post-neoliberal future? So yeah, anyone can take that up if you'd like.
So I wanted to maybe pick up a little bit first on what Nelson said, because I actually think there's a very interesting contrast between the program of the Clintonites with Rubin at the helm and the program of Biden, who of course was a participant and agreed with much of the Clinton agenda, and his principal economic advisor, Brian Deese, who also comes out of Wall Street, in this case, BlackRock rather than Goldman Sachs. And if you think about two massive departures, one of which is the main anti-poverty strategy of the Clinton years was the earned income tax credit, which was kind of the salve they gave for having taken away brutally, in my opinion, the cash entitlement to poor women, largely significantly poor women of color. In the 90s, the welfare reform, the salve, the compensation was the earned income tax credit, which was preconditioned on having a job, right? So it arguably equally functions as a subsidy to low-wage employers who don't pay enough for people to live, but they get a kind of wage subsidy through the ETC. Fast forward to today, and you get the refundable child tax credit, which goes to the very poorest people in the country without any work requirement at all, and is a massive, actual, serious anti-poverty program. That's a massive transition. And then secondly, the Deese-Biden program today is a program of public investment, government investment, the green economy, the care economy. It basically says government investment is not inherently worse. It might even be better than private investment. And that's a radical departure from the Clinton Rubin program. Now, that doesn't illustrate to me that there's some beneficence or some benevolence or something has changed in the governing class. It illustrates to me that there's actually something changing in the country. And there's something in the way of social movements, the Fight for 15, the movement for Black Lives, et cetera, that has broken the hold, the stranglehold of that ideology, which did so much damage for so long to so many people. And that's partly what I find so encouraging.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that?
Well, I'd like to come back to your original query, Joel, about the sort of shift in the economy and the shrinkage of manufacturing, which I don't think there's any mystery about. I mean, the same thing happened to agriculture in an earlier time. Like, that's one thing capitalism is good at, is raising productivity. So you need fewer workers to make the same amount of stuff. And we saw that with agriculture long ago, then it happened in manufacturing. So that's sort of part of the story of why the center of the labor market is service-based. But there is another piece to that too, which is, I think, eloquently analyzed in Gabe Wynant's new book, The Next Shift, that I'm sure many of our viewers, or whatever you're called, our audience, has heard about or is familiar with, which points out that that the expansion of things like healthcare really was a legacy of the New Deal that we haven't lost. And that book goes into great detail about that whole shift. But I think that's really important in both cases, both private sector service work and things like healthcare, which is sort of partly private sector, but a big chunk of it public sector, as well as education. The labor force, that's the workers that are involved in that, are disproportionately female, very different from the manufacturing-centered workforce you mentioned at the beginning. And I think that has a lot of political implications for what we're talking about here. Well, for one thing, what remains of the labor movement is centered in those sectors, especially education. Something like 30% of all US union members are teachers today. I mean, imagine. And healthcare is, I don't know what the number is, but it's another substantial chunk. And it's also where there's a lot of action going on right now. And well, we all know about the teacher strikes a couple of years ago, starting with Chicago further back. And actually nurses and other healthcare workers are pretty active too in the, it's like the sort of one of the few areas where there's a lot going on despite the bleak picture overall. And more generally, women obviously are far more central to the political scene than they were in the mid 20th century. I mean, you all know that. There's a gender gap in political ideology. Identification. Women are very much to the left of men, which was not true in those days. They have become leaders in a lot of the new social movements. Black Lives Matter has a disproportionately female and queer, by the way, leadership. Very different from previous such movements. Somebody mentioned Theda Skocpol earlier. She's also done all this work to show how many women have become activists in more mainstream Democratic Party politics. So there's something important going on here. And I don't think it's an accident that that has elevated social policies like paid family leave, childcare, and the income transfers that Deepak just mentioned. And then the next one isn't so gendered, maybe UBI, universal basic income. Who would have thought that that would be like part of the mainstream conversation in the United States of America? I mean, it's sort of extraordinary. And so I agree with Deepak, this is something new that ironically, Biden is sort of the spokesperson for a lot of this stuff. And he's not the generation that put it on the agenda, in my view. I mean, I think it comes from this younger generation who are activists in these various movements that we've seen unfold, and since the Great Recession, basically. But this 78-year-old white guy is the sort of spokesperson on the national stage for a lot of it. And I think that is the basis for optimism. We don't know how much of it is actually going to be enacted, of course. That very much remains to be seen, but it's pretty exciting, I think. And, never let a good crisis go to waste. I mean, nobody's mentioned the pandemic on this panel, but I'm not sure this would have been possible without that. Just as Obama was elected in the midst of the financial crisis. There's no way to know what would have happened if, but I think Biden's victory probably reflects the ways in which this current crisis has exposed all these fissures in the society that, were there all along, but were not as obvious to most people. So anyway, enough.
Thank you for that. I want to get Tori in on this because I agree with Deepak and Ruth. Like, it's remarkable the extent to which Biden is able to push certain, fiscal policies through the Recovery Acts. But it's curious when I think about the period that Nelson was talking about. The discourse was very much welfare queens. We need to reform welfare and welfare as we know it. And the singular figure here was like the single Black mother. And there was just a very entrenched racial politics that sort of propelled that policy reform, which seems to not really be the case in the current moment. So maybe, Tori, you could sort of speak on what has happened or how do you see that evolution happening over time right now?
Well, it's complicated, as my students like to say, but I think it actually is complicated. So I'm not just being glib. on the one hand, there's a lot to be optimistic about, I think, on the racial front, right? I mean, it is great, as you point to, Joel, that at this moment, we don't have to hear about welfare queens. And I spent the entire 1990s pissed off at, the Clinton administration, right? I mean, as I've said many times, I never voted for Bill Clinton. I sat out in 92 and I sat out in 96, and I cast my protest vote in 2000 because I couldn't co-sign the racialized war on poor people that Bill Clinton certainly was into, right? That we got by way of the Omnibus Crime Act and Hope 6 and welfare reform, et cetera, et cetera. And NAFTA didn't do Black people any good, right? NAFTA hurt Black workers, at a higher rate than white workers. So again, I mean, it's great that we've had this realization that maybe super predators was a bad thing. And maybe we've even come to realize that super predators were racist. But there's an interesting thing about this, right? I mean, I'm really uncomfortable about the moral awakening or reckoning framework, because I think one of the things that people who are swept up in the moral reckoning framework seem not to appreciate the fact is that crack babies, super predators, welfare queens, but we'll pick mainly on crack babies and super predators, were also part of a moral panic, right? I mean, when Hillary Clinton made the racist super predator case, in one interview, at least one, she had said something to the effect that, we can debate where these people come from, right? I mean, where they come from, that's up for grabs. The problem is they're here now, and we need tough on crime legislation to deal with them. And so again, I mean, the first thing that's worth keeping sight of is, while it's good that we've moved beyond that racialist framework that was the basis for all of this draconian, or at least what contributed to a draconian set of policies that impacted Blacks disproportionately, Black and brown people disproportionately, but not exclusively, we haven't actually jettisoned the racialist framework as it pertains to understanding inequality, right? Or we haven't fully complicated it, I guess maybe is a better way to put it, because now we are in the throes of another moral panic, which has some potentially better implications, right? I mean, I'm certainly happy to see, again, Officer Derek Chauvin be convicted, right, for killing George Floyd. And I was 21 at the time of the Rodney King verdict, and really pissed off about that. Like I said, I spent the 90s pissed. But anyway, this current moral reckoning framework, again, remains wed to a kind of racialist presumptions about the world that displace the role of class in determining racial outcomes, right? Or class's influence in shaping what we see as racial inequalities. So, for example, we recall last summer that there was a push to discuss COVID-19 infections in race-specific terms. And it was, in fact, a moral imperative that we discuss COVID-19 as the virus, as essentially the Black Plague, right? The virus that was affecting Blacks so disproportionately that it seemed that race had to have been a factor. And of course, as the evidence has come in, as I think was predictable at the time, it was clear that race wasn't really the star of the show. It couldn't be the star of the show, right? Because race isn't a biological category, but instead, these social issues, right? These social factors, like whether or not one was a essential worker, whether or not one lived in neighborhoods with high population density or was likely to rely on public transportation, et cetera, et cetera. The same would be at play to a degree with police killings and mass incarceration and all these things too, right? I mean, if you do look at the numbers on police killings, people who are murdered at the hands of police officers, I mean, you'll see that whites are the majority and Blacks are overrepresented, right? But just as in the 90s, Blacks' overrepresentation among the inmate population, let's say, or people or perpetrators of violent crimes or property theft was equated with the totality, right? The disproportionality of Blacks' overrepresentation translated into a presumption that what was going on was that there was something embedded in Black people, or something about Black people that made them criminals because they were overrepresented. So that became the totality, hence super predators. Blacks overrepresentation among the inmate population, Blacks overrepresentation among people who were murdered by police officers, Blacks overrepresentation among victims of COVID-19, or at least actually that last one's not even really true. That becomes evidence once again that it's all about race, but class isn't really a factor. And hopefully you see that connection, because I'm making this up in real time, unscripted. So while there's cause for optimism here, right? As I said, I'm glad that Officer Chauvin was convicted. Very glad about that. And it stands in sharp contrast to, you know, what I witnessed as a young man a long, long time ago. I'm pretty apprehensive about the path forward as it pertains to this racial reckoning framework, because since class isn't as much part of that narrative, but race is, we get this kind of racial pluralist construct that presumes, and you can see this borne out in the discourse on reparations and the like, that insists that the challenges of Blacks up and down the class ladder are the same. And what will benefit then, let's say, the Robert Smiths or Robert Johnsons in the world will trickle down to Black folk, to poor and working class Black folk, that we have to, let's say, grow the ranks of Black entrepreneurs to close the racial wealth gap. And it makes sense that people would say that, because 80% of the racial wealth gap is between the top 10% of white wage earners and the top 10% of Black wage earners. So if you want to close the racial wealth gap, there's an easy way to do it: grow the ranks of Black millionaires and billionaires. That doesn't mean that that's going to trickle down, right? And in fact, one of the nice things about the Sanders campaign, and I think this is actually true of Trumpism, but in a not nice way, obviously, is that both of them were expressions, I think, in part, more transparently in Sanders' case than with Trump's. But nonetheless, I think that both Sanders and Trump reveal massive dissatisfaction with neoliberalism, right? I mean, and of course, trickle down. There it is. I said it. And so we get this pushback against neoliberalism and even trickle down. And yet, in the racial justice framework that we're operating with at this moment, people seem to imagine, many of us seem to imagine, that while trickle down didn't work at the macroeconomic level, because Black people supposedly share a singular interest, that it'll actually work with Black people. So you grow the ranks of Black entrepreneurs, again, with the expectation that the wealth will trickle, that Black bosses are better bosses to Black people. And just as apparently white bosses are supposed, the implication would be white bosses would be better bosses to white people. I've been to West Virginia. That's clearly not true. So there's some good things in this moment, but there's also, I think, some things that merit sober reflection. And the kind of moralism, I don't really think is the left is the path forward for social democracy, at least not this expression of moralism.
In answer to the question which you posed, what's the prospect for social democracy? So with Ruth and others, I want to say that in the immediate and maybe the midterm, hey, that's good. This is a 78-year-old white guy. He's doing great. Okay, so I agree with that. But in the long term, unless some fundamental things happen, I'm pretty pessimistic. And that's because, and this, I think, reference to some things that Tori was saying, unless it's not enough to build, we spend a lot of time, and properly so, trying to figure out how to build a robust, democratic, multiracial labor movement, other movements, whatever, Black Lives Matter and others. And that's great, and we should, and that's essential. But unless we get some control over capital, over the mobility of capital, maybe it won't happen tomorrow or 2 years from now or whatever, but at some point, you're going to have, this, that 1%, actually 1/10 of 1% is going to say, wait a minute, we're withdrawing confidence in what's going on here in the United States, and we're moving it somewhere. And then you end up with things like, neutron bombs were dropped all over the industrial Midwest, and destroyed the labor movement when we had capital mobility move to either Mexico or China, and that's and Krugman talks about, oh yeah, well we can have a service economy, which you can to some degree, but it, as Gabe shows, financialization has affected the healthcare industry, just and of course higher education as well. So we have to, the left has to have a program, and it did in the progressive era and in the New Deal. There were, along with the rise of the labor movement, there were important laws that were passed and movements to tame and control capital and make banking boring. And they did that for 30 years. And the same was true with Bretton Woods, which was a big restriction on mobility of capital. And until we do that, we're sort of waiting, for the capitalists or the Wall Streeters or maybe they'll be in Europe or China to come along and say, well, we're pulling out of New York City, we're just pulling out, and you'll end up with some combination, which is what Trump had discovered, of economic despair and racism, and they come together in this explosive and toxic mix, and that's what's what happened in a lot of America, and we have that's why in the long run I'm pessimistic unless we have this kind of both intellectual / movement and ideological policy and actual movement to do something about capital.
Thank you for that. Deepak, did you have something?
Yeah, I think to your point of the future of social democracy, in some ways the future depends on the ability to find a new synthesis around questions of class, race, and gender that works at the level of program, that works at the level of coalition, and that actually works in people's lived experience. So some of the problem historically has been a class reductionist approach, which has viewed issues around policing or incarceration or immigration as kind of tangential concerns, not working class concerns, but as sort of social issues that are off to the side. What I think is encouraging about the last decade or so of struggle is that workers' movements and racial justice movements have been closely intertwined and drawn on each other. So I don't think you can understand the Fight for 15 and the impact that's had on workers' wages, except by reference to the fact that it has drafted to a substantial degree on energy and identity in the Black freedom struggle. I don't think you can understand the explosion of immigrant worker centers or the organization on a mass scale of janitors in the country, except with reference to the relationship of immigrant identity and worker identity. So it's like an ongoing problem. It is a tension, it is maybe the tension, but I want to, I guess, invite us to the possibility of a new synthesis rather than falling back into some of the patterns that have, I feel like, plagued us and riven our program and riven our coalition in ways that have harmed progress. So I'm actually quite optimistic that I think, at least in the activism that I see in the movement for Black Lives, the immigrant rights movement, the youth climate movement, more effort to center a critique of capitalism than one would have 10 or 20 years ago. And at least in some parts of the labor movement, not all by a long shot, some effort to really reckon with the history of exclusion in the country and in the movement that might point a path forward. So it feels like very tentative, and I'm not usually the resident optimist on any panel. So, I'm doing my bit here to liven things up. But I do think that synthesis is not just a pipe dream. I think it is possible to achieve.
Can I just add something? It's partly to harmonize with something that Deepak said, but something that might deviate just a little bit. I think that it's very clear to me that coalitions are necessary, right? And coalitions certainly have to be transracial, right? They have to be interracial. They have to cross gender lines, et cetera, right? Because everybody's affected. Everyone who works for a living is affected by capitalism. at least everyone who works for a living in the United States or any other capitalist system is affected by capitalism and the flow of capital and all matters on that spectrum. But I would complicate the narrative just a little bit, or seek complication on narrative about the history of class reductionism and the understandings of racial inequality. And I'll do this maybe by way of a two point on the fly way. It was the case not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, where Black Americans certainly tended to understand racial inequality and economic inequality being two elements of the same thing, right? And it's logical. It's not as if I will channel the spirit of Barbara Jean Fields, but I won't quote her. It's white people enslaved Black people just because they didn't like Black people. They sure inconvenienced themselves to achieve that end, and also just happened to make a lot of money, at least those who owned slaves in the process, right? It was quite a feat to get from Western Europe around Cape Verde and then to cross the Atlantic just because you don't want to be mean to Black people, right? So obviously, going back to 1619, right, or the early 1500s, even better, that there was an economic imperative behind the exploitation of Blacks. And that certainly would continue to be the case once we have the United States proper. There's an economic imperative that's informing the exploitation of sharecroppers, right? I mean, it's sharecropping, not white people's permanent sadistic camp for Blacks, right? And sharecroppers were often enough white too. And they also got the fuzzy end of the lollipop, even if they didn't get the fuzziest end of the fuzzy end of the lollipop. And the they in this case would be the white sharecroppers. So it would be, and of course, Black workers and industry could look at pay scales, pay structures, posted pay structures in the era before an FEPC or affirmative action, and see that whites were paid a higher rate than Blacks for the same work, let's say, when that was an option. And even among whites, depending on what type of white person they were, and they weren't necessarily really white, depending on when you're talking about an early 20th century, you could see the way that ethnicity, or what we would think of as ethnicity, but employers in the first quarter or third of the 20th century would have understood to be race, influenced one's economic prospects of the job, and ditto in housing markets, right? So as a result, I mean, it's not surprising that, let's say, Black populists understood that sharecropping was not just about racial domination, but was about class exploitation. It's also not surprising that Black leftists during the Great Migration, many of them anyway, at least those classified as leftists, would have understood labor force exploitation or racially tiered housing and labor markets as an expression of capitalist exploitation. But more to the point, that even mainstream Black liberals by the New Deal and World War II, all the way up to Black Power, and it kind of drops off around Black Power, understood that racism was in some part an expression of economic exploitation. It's kind of the language of economic exploitation. And white people got screwed by racially tiered housing markets and, of course, labor markets. And that was the basis for a certain degree of solidarity among Blacks and whites in the labor movement. That's the first part that I want to go to. But the second part, because I've talked too long, so sorry about that, is I want to turn this point over to Nelson, because I teach the first couple of chapters of State of the Union in one of my AFAM classes, right? And my students are initially taken aback because for them, like, WTF, everything else has Black people in the title, right? Every other book on that syllabus has Blacks in the title, but then there's the State of the Union book. So what's going on here? And I have to walk them through it. But I teach, the first couple of chapters of State of the Union, partly because it's a window onto that point that I just made, right? I mean, partly because Nelson devotes a lot of time in the first couple of chapters, and some of them actually read the whole book. But Nelson devotes a lot of good and useful space to exploring the way that the CIO, right, industrial unions, sought interracial solidarity. And of course, the basis for that was, came in a variety of forms. And Nelson should talk about this, more than me, but if he wants. but it came in a variety of forms, right? Many of the organizers were communists and had CIO organizers were communists and had an ideological commitment, which is awesome. John L. Lewis, maybe not so ideological, bit of a pragmatist on that front, but he understood this basic point that I made about the role of race in undercutting the livelihood of everybody, right? The work that race does in capitalism to promote counter-solidaristic sensibilities in that era at the expense of working people, Black and white alike. And the way that trade unions in that era approached this issue was to point to the things that, working people had in common. One of the things that I think is maybe potentially toxic about the way that we talk about race today, and again, I need to say this: I didn't want to vote for Obama in 2008 because I was infuriated by his post-racial framework, and I feel the need to stress that point because it's important to appreciate the fact that many of us who stress the importance of thinking about the things that we have in common as working people aren't denying that racism is real. And I was pissed off that President Obama co-signed, underclass ideology, right, through his reactionary post-racial framework, which is why I didn't want to vote for him. Sarah Palin pushed me there, so I did. But it's important to appreciate that basic element. Racism is certainly real. Acknowledging, though, that Black people, white people, Hispanic people, fill in the blank, men, women, fill in the blank, actually are all impacted by capitalism in negative ways. If you work for a living, is not to deny the realness of racism. It's to form a bridge. It's among other things to A, point to a fact, and B, to establish a bridge of commonality that is the basis of solidarity. And a while back, Deepak had made the point about the value of nurturing solidarity. And this is why I make this reference to Nelson's great book that I assigned and would like him to talk about the CIO if he is so inclined. The basis of solidarity, I think, is not best served by telling white people that they're privileged even when they can't afford to make ends meet. But Black people, including those who have been president of the United States, or tenured professors, right, in relatively well-paying, cushy jobs, are the victims of oppression. But again, that poor whites aren't exploited or that they're necessarily winners. That's not the basis for solidarity and moving forward. That's the basis for Trumpism, right? That's what that is. That's pushing those people who are losing in the system to the other side. And so again, I'm just going to shut up right after I say this last point. I think it's crucially important for us to think about the things that we have in common, which is not a denial of racism or sexism or anything else, because that's the basis for building coalitions and empathy. And that's crucially important because if you have this basis of solidarity, right, if you talk about the things that you have in common, then the other becomes humanized for some, maybe many, and they might therefore be more sensitive to the problems of racism or sexism or fill in the blank. But I don't know if Nelson wants to talk about the CIO. I'm sorry to put you on blast like that.
I don't want to monopolize. Maybe Ruth or someone should go first, and I'll come back. I'll answer. I'll come right back to what you want to say something about it. But I don't want to monopolize things.
I actually did have a related question specifically directed to Ruth, because obviously race isn't just black and white, and I wanted to talk about immigration. And Nelson, feel free to jump in after I ask this question to Ruth. But and here I'm going to be oversimplifying one particular book, but since 1965, there's been an increase in immigration, both documented and undocumented. And Jeff Cowie famously published his book on the Great Exception. And this is, again, oversimplifying the case. But, part of what he's arguing is that these restrictive immigration policies and sort of exclusions of social citizenship is what made the New Deal possible in certain ways. I think is a very provocative and interesting argument. I have a critique of it. But I'm curious, Ruth, precisely because you just published a book on immigrant labor, but how you think sort of immigration complicates or changes sort of social democratic politics, both as like just straight up a factor of labor, but also in its racial politics as well?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, let me say a couple things. One is, I think I like Cowie's book in other respects, but I think on this point, which he does argue that the New Deal was predicated on it does coincide in time with the period of restricted immigration, and that's part of what made it possible. So I think there he's confusing causation and correlation, to put it simply. But I think it's interesting to think about this in relation to the CIO question that Torrey mentioned a minute ago, because in fact, the whole logic of the CIO, which was led mostly by second generation working class immigrants, was what Liz Cohen famously called a culture of unity, this idea that, which is what we need now, right? She shows how in order to build a kind of coherent class-based ideology, the CIO had to lift up the things that African Americans as well as immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe had in common. And that's what made the CIO successful. That's what she argues. And I think there's a strong analogy to the situation we face today against the background of Trump's success, which was precisely the opposite, to divide people along those lines, both in relation to immigrants, recent immigrants, this time from the global South, and about African Americans, right? That was Trump's genius in a way, was to pit the white working class against those populations. And conversely, our challenge as progressives is to do the opposite, to figure out how to do what the CIO did, how to figure out, how do we stitch those groups together and, create a political discourse that coordinates rather than dissolves that coordinates their common interests. I think that's what we all want to do. In this group anyway. And there's a few things on our side. I feel like I'm turning into a Pollyanna today, but there's two things on our side in that quest. One is just numbers and demography, right? And this is of course what freaks out the right, the whole replacement theory thing, right? That, the immigrant population is mostly driving this, but we are headed toward, what they call a majority minority society. That's pretty much inexorable. I mean, there's no stopping it. You can block off the political implications of that with laws like the one they just passed in Georgia, maybe, but the reality is that's what's happening, right? And then along with that, I don't know, I was thinking about this in relation to our original question of social democracy. I feel like we now have sort of social democracy, or socialism if you want, with a kind of intersectional face. Like that's the innovation of this latest political generation, right? Is to talk about, unlike the CIO or the, you could call it class reductionist politics of the old New Deal, now really you can't escape race, gender, the Me Too movement, immigration, the LGBTQ stuff. I mean, and it's all part of the same mosaic. And I think for young people anyway on the left, it's sort of the same thing. Like that, they can't imagine socialism or social democracy in the terms we've been talking about today without that. It's central to the whole agenda. So I think that's the other basis for optimism. I mean, that generation is the future. So you put that together with the racial and immigrant-based demographics, and things look more promising, despite the problems that I think are very real. What Nelson pointed to about addressing the power of capital. Obviously, we have to do that too. But the only way to do that, I think, is to meld the interests of those different groups into one, coordinated culture of unity, to use Liz Cohen's term again. So
I will say one thing about the CIO. Thank you for the nice words, Tori. We don't want to be romantic about the CIO or any social movement, period, but certainly not the. I mean, there were lots of anti-union workers and people who saw the CIO as some foreign alien, / black, conspiracy. But I mean, but as you were saying, as Tori was saying, it was in the self-interest of many whites who were otherwise racist or just out of it to bring African Americans into the world of the CIO, because otherwise your strike would be lost, and that was just simple. And so that I think that you find these strange situations where unquestionably people who were white workers or usually secondary union leaders were came out of some. They didn't want to have dances with integrated dances, but when it came to shop floor activity, they were integrationist, or at least solidarity in favor of that, which is, I think, one of the things that as an institution, the trade union movement does that. And that's one of the great things about what Josh shows that in Working Class New York. And it's true in today, unquestionably. It does that. And it's hard to find other sort of institutions which as the essence of their succeeding have to be interracial. They can't not be. I would say that the most controversial part of that book, State of the Union, and problematic and is the stuff about rights in the 60s and the degree to which does the rise of a rights consciousness in some way undercut senses of solidarity. And I think it's probably both ways, and I wrote another introduction to it where I discussed various people written that. I don't think there's one answer to that, but it clearly is something to be thought about. And I have to say, I'd like some other people to comment. I'll stop after I say comment on this phrase, class reductionist. What does that actually mean? I was called a class reductionist once on Twitter, and I didn't quite know what to do. So would someone tell me what to do when someone calls me a class reductionist, or other people? What is the meaning of that phrase today?
Well, first, Nelson, I think you should get off Twitter. But beyond that, I believe, Deepak, you brought up that phrase, and then I want to have space for audience Q&A, and I have one more question that's maybe out of left field, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So, Deepak, if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the axis on which the project of social democracy will turn. So it's kind of valuable to struggle a little bit in it and to engage in it. So I think my own view is that downplaying the distinctive experiences of particular parts of the working class coalition we want will not lead to class unity. That in fact, it lays the predicate for the kind of demonization of racial minority groups of immigrants that Trump practiced. In other words, Obama's failure to address or acknowledge certain historic problems, and in fact, to play in, as Toure said, to certain tropes, his failure to address immigration, his deportations, all of that actually created a condition for Trumpism. So I think you can have a politics, and I think this is kind of the argument that Heather McGhee is making in her new book, The Sum of Us, which is both universalistic and targeted. That is to say that offers a broad platform of universal benefit on healthcare, Medicare for all, and guaranteed income, and et cetera, in the context of a labor agenda, and that is very forthright about saying we have to end mass incarceration, which disproportionately harms communities, address racist policing, and et cetera, that the kind of targeted universalist approach, which I see emergent, it's actually happening in much politics among young people and in progressive sections of the labor movement and in racial justice struggles. That I think is the future. That is what I mean is what is not class reductionism, that embraces the difference as part of embracing the entire working class politics. The other thing I just want to say briefly is I think one of the other edges for social democratic politics in this period is going to be internationalism. So and Ruth kind of put her finger on this point, the extent to which, if because of climate change, for example, we have millions of people seeking refuge in the United States because their home countries have been made unlivable, unarable, because of extreme temperatures and weather events, unless there is a kind of proactive part of social democratic politics that is welcoming to immigrants, it will be a chronic vulnerability to break apart that coalition, and it will succeed. So it's both on pragmatic grounds and also on moral grounds that I'm arguing for significant, not exclusive, but significant attention to these kinds of challenging issues.
I agree with Deepak that one has to have programs that are clearly universal, that address the problems of economic inequality that impact working people. And certainly that racism, sexism, xenophobia are all real, et cetera. And of course that policies like affirmative action, anti-discrimination policies are necessary. But while I agree with all of that, I've been called the class reductionist. And I think Nelson agrees with all that. And apparently we know he's been called the class reductionist because he just told us, on Twitter, right, where nuanced assessments go to die. But anyway, so what I'm curious about is, so for example, the charge of class reductionism was writ large during 2015, 2016, the start of Sanders, immediately after Sanders had announced his plans to run for the Democratic nomination. Class reductionism is the thing, right? That's ubiquitous. And he was, of course, characterized as a class reductionist. And the thing that seemed odd to me about that, and it seems odd to me with respect to the shotgun blast that is often enough the charge of class reductionism, it's often directed at people who insist that racism is real, sexism is real, homophobia is real, and remedies for those things are necessary. They're not making a case against rolling back anti-discrimination policies or laws, but they also, those people who are often charged as class reductionists, again, acknowledge the realness of those kinds of discriminatory actions, the realness of targeted discrimination, right? But also simultaneously insist that anti-discrimination policies alone would be, are insufficient to redress, racial inequality, right? They're insufficient to redress income inequality. If you're interested in Black poverty, ending Black poverty, well, we already know that anti-discrimination policies can't fix that, because that was one of the main problems with the war on poverty, right? Because the Johnson administration eschewed kind of social democratic policies that people like A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin or Martin Luther King had advocated, and instead fought a war on poverty on the cheap that centered on growth and culturalist explanations for poverty, and of course, anti-discrimination policies. And all of those things, so the anti-discrimination policies, as important as they are, if they didn't exist, my parents wouldn't have had the great jobs that they had. My dad was a professor, retired a year or so ago. My mom was actually a Black woman corporate HR executive, believe it or not. If you know who my dad is, talk about irony. Big shock that they divorced, right? But anyway, and so they wouldn't have had the great jobs that they had access to. They wouldn't have been the young homeowners that they were. And that wouldn't have trickled down to me if it weren't for those kinds of policies. But to say that those policies were important in helping to shore up a once nascent and now real Black middle class is not to suggest that they are sufficient, and they certainly weren't sufficient. And there's not reason to believe that they still would be. So what I'm struck by is the tendency to call people class reductionists who actually do acknowledge that racism, sexism, homophobia, et cetera, are real and require legal remedies to counter them, but also insist that those anti-discrimination policies alone are inadequate. And it strikes me that what's going on is that many people who make the argument that I just made also embrace the follow through on the real implications of the social constructiveness of race, which would also mean that even if Black people face discrimination, let's say, across class lines, we don't all have the same class interests. What's good for Black billionaires is not good for Black permanent temporary employees necessarily. So again, it strikes me that the charge is often unwieldy, or maybe even, and I wouldn't suggest that this was what anyone in this panel is doing, but out in the world of Twitter, but which who cares about? But including the world of the DNC, the charge is actually leveled at people who challenge the hegemony of neoliberalism, right? Who insists that we need more than modest reforms to open opportunities for racial minorities, whatever their sex, or women, whatever their race or ethnicity, to be corporate executives or professors, for that matter.
Thank you. That's a lot. That was wonderful. I'm sure we could keep that discussion going on for a long time. It is time to move to audience Q&A, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask one last question that might be completely out of left field. And if it falls flat, we can just move to audience questions. But Tori mentioned the 90s, how you spent the 90s angry, and I spent the 90s in elementary school, which, I don't mean to put all you on the spot for that, but I'm an immigrant. I was born in Mexico, and I moved to the US in the early 90s. And we lived in a hotel for the first couple months or so in Southern California. And I remember having the TV on every night because my parents watched the news, and we saw the Rodney King riots or rebellion. And then we also saw images of the Gulf War. And at the time, I was very young, and I thought they were the same thing. And I asked my parents what's going on, and they're like, oh no, there's this thing happening in Los Angeles, and then there's this thing happening in the Middle East. And my initial thought coming from Mexico was like, this is an incredibly violent country.
Which is true.
But this is, the 1990s, 1980s, I just kept thinking also other foreign policy. So this question is about empire. A lot of immigration came from Central America. And the sort of social democracy that Josh writes about at mid-century, this was, it's not just the golden age of capitalism. It's not just the period of the New Deal order. It's also the Cold War. It's the period of American empire. So I'm curious what you all think, precisely because some people are very optimistic about Biden's domestic policies, and people from Doug Henwood to Noam Chomsky say I'm pleasantly surprised about the domestic stuff. And then immigration and foreign policy, it's bad. But they're always segmented. So I'm wondering what place does foreign policy and American imperialism have in social democratic politics? And how do they relate to class, if at all? And if that's true.
I think a lot of foreign policies now become trade policy. I mean, that's certainly with China. That's the big thing. And trade policy is really what's a huge thing, obviously linked to capital mobility, but when it takes place either with say NAFTA or China, it just had this devastating effect not on the entire country. In fact, you can make the argument that free trade is good for the entire consuming population, but it has devastating impacts on specific groups and regions and things of that sort. So I just want to say that I mean, and then of course, and there is a kind of neo-Cold War element coming. And I must say, as I watched Rachel Maddow denounce the Russian-Trump connection, I liked most of it, but at a certain point, I thought, wait a minute, what's going on here? There is a kind of looking for enemies abroad. I don't doubt that the Russians did all the nasty things they were said to be done, but there has been a kind of, given the old foreign policy establishment, the people who got us into Iraq, a kind of free pass because they're anti-Trumpers. But now let me stop there.
Does anyone else want to chime in, or should we move to audience questions?
I'll just say briefly, I think European social democracy has foundered on the inability of left parties to reckon squarely with the question of immigration. And a similar thing will happen here. The great failure, one of the failures thus far of Biden's presidency has been on the question of immigration. And without a greater centering of that issue, understanding of the role of US foreign policy in driving migration from the Northern Triangle countries, all of that, we're in for some form of Trumpism 2.0 making hay of that reality. So it is an imperative to be a core part of a social democratic agenda.
Thanks for that. So we have about 10 minutes. We have 4 or 5 questions, but I'm going to pick one because it's somewhat related to sort of foreign policy and working class politics. So one person wrote, and this was directed to Tori, but I think it applies for everyone. And it seems facetious, but I think it's actually kind of interesting. Did Trump capture working class populism better than Sanders, and how much of the labor and working class vote goes to Trump? So Another way to think about it too is the sort of shift within the Democratic Party and Republican Party in terms of its constituency, which I'm sure you all are very familiar with more and more college educated people drifting to the Democratic Party. So you can direct that question or answer that question directly, or just think about working class politics and appeals between the two major parties in the U.S.
Am I supposed to take point on this?
Sure.
Since it had my name. I don't have to, because I've talked a lot. I don't know if Trump captured working class voters better than Sanders. I mean, I remember this was a line that went back to 2016, and I forget which newspaper, which magazine did a segment on a West Virginia town. It's one of the poorest in the nation that Trump captured. But what they left off is that Bernie carried that town in a primary, right? Mm-hmm. So, it was, I think the question is maybe would be better framed as, did Trump do better with working class whites, I guess, than Hillary? Because I don't think that he did do better with working class whites than Bernie. And that's a reflection, I think, on what Hillary was selling, which, to her nominal defense, this isn't much of a defense though, obviously. Some of the baggage that she was carrying was maybe her husband's baggage, NAFTA. I have personal connections to people in the labor movement. I won't call them out. And one in the building trades, and this person who I couldn't be closer to who works in the building trades as a labor functionary, works in a field that probably wouldn't have been so impacted by NAFTA, but that didn't change the fact that people in the building trades were often pissed off about NAFTA anyway. So again, I mean, I don't think that he captured working class whites better than Sanders. There was a lot of understandable apprehension about HRC, and I think some about Biden. And I'll just say this, just to be controversial. I guess as much as I very much appreciate, as I've alluded to, the pushback against post-racialism and underclass ideology and all that stuff, right, which was horrible, and as we've touched upon many times, pissed me off in the 1990s when Joel was a child. I was at least in my 20s, for what it's worth. But anyway, as much as I'm glad we pushed back against that, as one who is empathetic, and I think one of the things that you learn as a historian is the importance of empathy, right? Not sympathy, but empathy, because historians have to understand the zeitgeist of their subjects, and that feels to me that that's on the spectrum of empathy. I can very much appreciate how the narrow discourse on inequality that really took hold in 2015-16, I'll just say it by way of the reparations discourse, actually does the devil's work. And it does the devil's work because it dovetails with the narrative of white displacement, right? I mean, if you're going to make a case, if you know that the other side is insisting and has been insisting since I was a child that affirmative action, let's say, is unfairly advantaging lazy blacks with the eye toward, and then other minorities and women, but it's usually affirmative blaction is how people tend to talk about it. If you're alive to the fact that since the 70s or 80s, that's been the line about affirmative action as something that unfairly advantages unqualified blacks with an eye toward displacing qualified whites. In 4 decades or more, contemporaneous with 4 decades or more of decline for the bottom 80%, 60 or 80% of American workers, then the least smart case that you could make for racial justice is reparations. Because what that screams to those people who have a misunderstanding about what affirmative action is, right? Because affirmative action isn't a set of quotas, but that's the perspective that most people have on affirmative action, racial quotas, which is crucial to understanding the line about white displacement. Making a case for a welfare program that only Black people could could benefit from, which is easily cast as, robbing Peter, in this case, Peter would be a white person, to pay Paul, and that case would be Paul would be a black person, again, pushes people to embrace, unfortunately, people who are, experiencing precarity themselves, right? It's a nice thing about teaching a public university is, as opposed to going to the institutions that I attended, you get to see a broad slice of American, class life, including the regular middle class people. It pushes people who are themselves experiencing precarity to actually take seriously some guy who is a game show host, let's say, or some other charlatan, if we're comfortable casting it this way, who's a racial opportunist, right? And the like. So anyway, that's all I got to say.
Thank you. That's great. So we have time for one more question, and a lot of the questions I've been asking are big, broad picture. So I want to end the way we started with Ruth and ask a very specific question, because I know you publish the report on unionism in New York yearly. So this last question is, and I'll just read it here. Many European models of social democracy have built and are built by sectoral bargaining institutions, so that workers don't have to compete between different companies. Could you talk a little bit about the dynamics behind sector level organizing in New York and beyond, and how that may affect the prospects of social democracy?
Wow. So yes, that's a great question. Whoever suggested it, thank you. I just think I should explain what this is before going any further, because I'm not sure everybody watching will necessarily know. So in many parts of Western Europe, instead of one union in a workplace negotiating with one management, the arrangement is that first of all, there can be more than one union in a workplace for folks to choose among, which we don't have that option here. But the unions work together to negotiate with the employers in their sector. That's what sectoral bargaining is, and it's brokered by the government. It's sometimes called tripartitism. So the three parties are in the room, and a discussion is had about what the wages and working conditions and so on should be in industry X. And what that means is that, say, in a country like France, where union density is just about as low as it is here, it doesn't matter as much as it does here, because that system is established and institutionalized, and the bargaining happens. I mean, obviously it's better if you have a stronger union, but still, it's not as debilitating to have low density as we have here. So there's been a lot of discussion of this as a potential model for labor revitalization or whatever, mostly among labor lawyers. But anyway, that conversation has been happening for a few years. And the one actually existing example of it is actually here in New York. So everybody, I think, is familiar at least a little bit with the Fight for 15, the fast food workers campaign that actually sort of emerged right after Occupy Wall Street, I think not accidentally, and eventually was a sort of SEIU project. Actually, it was pretty much all along, but they didn't advertise that so much in the very beginning. Anyway, what I've heard just through the grapevine, I'm not absolutely sure this is true, is that the plan all along was to do what actually happened in New York, which was to revive this practice of so-called wage boards, which are a kind of version of that same tripartite sectoral bargaining. And the way we got, even under Cuomo, the way we got the law giving fast food workers special wages was through that mechanism. And so the state established a wage board, the union was there, the employers were there, and that's what happened. Whether that could happen on a bigger scale or nationally, I'm very doubtful. But we do have a living example of it, and maybe it's a fitting way to end a panel on Josh's book, because it is a case of New York exceptionalism. Of this is the one place where this actually came to fruition. If people are interested, there's a terrific article in I think it's the Yale Law Journal, some law journal, by Kate Andreas that lays all this out in very clear document. Yeah. So if you're curious to hear more, that's the thing to look at. And she does discuss the New York case in some detail as a kind of model of what could be replicated more widely. So,
excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the panel. We We discussed social democracy in the past and in the present. We solved racism and the labor movement. So now we're onward to build a better future. But one last reminder, there's a special offer for Joshua's book to the first, I think, 100 attendees, and a $5 sort of deal for an ebook for all attendees. And there'll be a slide for it once I wrap up. Other than that, thank you, Deepak, Tori, Ruth, Nelson. It's been awesome hearing from you all, and I hope the rest of you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joel.